Hello, Deviant listeners. This is the last scheduled episode of our exploration of the Lake Oconee murders. In our next episode, we'll be doing our off-script, where we handle some of the loose ends and some of the things we weren't able to get to in the first 4 episodes here, including what you have to say. After you listen to this episode, we want to know what you think about all this. What do you think happened? What do you think needs to be done? There's a couple ways you could tell us about it. First, you could leave a comment in the comment and review section of wherever you are listening to this. 2, check out our Patreon at deviantpodcast.com. There are ways there to get a hold of us and tell us about what you think in our Discord also. 3rd, check us out on social. Hit us up there, also in the comments section, at deviant.podcast on Instagram and TikTok. Let us know what you think, or if you have any questions, ask them. We want to hear from you. But now, let's get into the episode. There are things that we talk about that may not be suitable for all audiences.
Obviously, there's a lot of that we've talked about in terms of the actual evidence. Have you brought in a profiler, or is that something that you guys have lent?
We've done that. We've gone down that path.
Way back in 2014. Yeah.
What's the profiler? What kind of?
We weren't able to glean any information from a profile because, like this, there was no solid profile that we felt was it. The case, when you go through the evidence, is just as strange to everyone else. So when you're actually in and you're reviewing everything, it's you get the same thing. Now we have had people that are profilers after the fact come in and say things about sheriff's seals and what they've done, and they're whack jobs. So.
But they're profilers. I mean, they came up with some common things, but the problem with the common things that in that profile is that it would have fit virtually every male, in Middle Georgia that, that has guns and knives and things like that. But yes. Yeah.
Knows how to drive a boat and has access to the layout. It's stuff that we knew.
That's everybody we know. Okay. I mean, but we still reached out and asked for that way back when that happened. And that's not the first case I've ever done that on, but it didn't point us in any kind of. I've sat here with 6 psychics from Ireland at the same table. I'll listen to anybody. Okay.
Sheriff Howard Sills makes it clear that when it comes to the murders of Shirley and Russell Dermond, he's up for a conversation with nearly anybody.
Yeah, other detectives, profilers, and, as you just heard, psychics. And if someone calls the main switchboard at his office about the Dermonds, operators know who takes that call. It's Sills. The case even has its own form for tips.
If you call in there, they're filling out that dispatcher's going to fill out that form. It's going to be at my door. If I'm not out of town, somebody's chief deputy, somebody's going to have it, that day or the next morning. And we've got stacks of them.
We've talked to a lot of people about this case too. When you explain this crime to someone who doesn't know about it and lay out the details of what's known, the response almost always seems to be the same. Wait, what? That's weird. That doesn't make any sense. And anyone who says that is right, because it is weird. And it doesn't make any sense. Right now, at least. The information is out there. The puzzle pieces that, when they're put together the right way, will make us all say, okay, yeah, I get it now.
For a decade now, the Dermond murder case has been sitting at the top of the pile on Howard Sills' desk. And in Georgia, when you tell someone, yeah, that murder case from Lake Oconee, they're going to tell you what they remember hearing about it. And then the immediate question, wait, that thing still isn't solved? No, it isn't.
We're all wired differently. Some of us are wired for good. Some of us are wired for bad. But a select few step outside all of society's boundaries. From Cold Open Media, this is Deviant, the Lake Oconee Murders, Part 4.
Welcome back to Deviant, where we chase the truth into the dark corners of what humans are capable of.
I'm Andrew Iden.
And I'm Dan Simitovich. Through the last 3 episodes, we've laid out what we know about that weekend in May of 2014, what we know about Russell and Shirley Dermond, their murders, and the dynamics of a crime scene that's yielded hardly anything. So this week, we're calling in some help. Let's bring in the profilers.
When a crime scene doesn't have physical evidence that points to anyone in particular, investigators still have moves. The crime scene itself can help tell the story. Who were the victims? How were they killed? What does it look like in and around the scene?
All that can add up to a general profile of the person who committed this crime. And there are people whose job it is to build that profile.
My name is Mark Safrick. I am currently the president of Forensic Behavioral Services. I am retired from the FBI. I spent 23 years in the FBI. Over 12 of those years I spent as a supervisor in the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which I think most people think of as or are aware of as the profiling unit. Before that, I spent most of my time in the FBI working violent crimes.
The Behavioral Analysis Unit, the BAU. It's the one you see on the TV and in the movies, Criminal Minds, Mindhunter, Silence of the Lambs. Real-life profilers, though, they're going to be the first to tell you that none of that you see in the TV and the movies, most of that isn't real. They don't fly on private jets. They don't bust into crime scenes with their guns drawn. It doesn't work like that.
Different law enforcement agencies have differing opinions on how effective criminal profiling actually is. Some see it as more art than science, while profilers view their work the opposite way. But Mark clearly does know the work. And while he hasn't worked the Dermond case specifically, he had some great insight into what a profiler would apply to a crime like this.
Whenever I do any kind of case, there's a list of things that I'm really interested in. The first is victimology. I need to understand who these people are because I'm trying to understand why they would be targeted for this type of a crime. When I look at the Dermond case, I think it's important that he's been retired for quite a while, right? So he's not involved in business. So he hasn't got, business partners or, he's not involved in lawsuits with attorneys or other factions. I mean, he's been retired for a long time. So, when people say they can't think of anybody that didn't like him, that's probably true, right? That's different for somebody who's, CEO of a company and they're working and, they just fired 175 people. That's a different dynamic. So that's important. Victimology is an extensive piece and the risk is part of that.
Yeah, I think that may be the definition of low risk victims here.
Yeah, just, on the surface, it seems like they're low risk, right? And not only that, but they live in an environment that's low risk. That
gated community, yeah.
As I understand it, yeah, gated community, not so much even that, just isolated, right? Mm-hmm. It's an off the beaten path. This isn't like you didn't just pull off the interstate, right. And 30 seconds later, you're driving into a residential community where you're going to, engage in criminal activity. This is a difficult place to find. Theirs is quite a ways from the entrance. It's on the cul-de-sac. It's surrounded by trees. I would say that their risk level is very low. On the contrary, the risk that the offender has to take to get to them, access to them, and then all of the machinations that this person or persons is going through, there's a lot going on here, right? And one of the areas that offenders cannot control is being seen. I mean, they can try to control for it. They can do things at night, late at night, under cover of darkness, or, when very few people are out. But they can never be sure that somebody doesn't see them, take notice of them, right? So driving into this community, you have to go through a guard check. You have to be identified. I get it. You don't, the cameras aren't working. They don't take down license plates. If you're coming in by car, you got to talk to somebody, right?
Right.
So now somebody's looking at you. They could identify you, your vehicle. So victimology is important. Then I'm also considering targeted or opportunistic victims. In targeted crimes, there's no doubt that this is, for me, is targeted. I think that there is a plan here, and you have to be prepared in this plan. You have to have a boat because she's 5 miles from the house. You have to have cinder blocks. You have to have paracord. You have to have a blue mesh bag. You have to have a plan, like what you're going to do with this person. You have to have a gun. You have to have some sharp implement that you're going to engage, in the decapitation process, which is also exceptionally rare in homicide cases. You just don't see decapitation unless you have some mental health problem or there is some other important dynamic, going on. There's some utilitarian factor here. That's why you're decapitating. So control. So, one thing when I would look at this, when you have 2 victims, rarely are both victims the target of the crime. Typically, it's one, and the other one is collateral damage. One is the target, probably Russ, probably the male in this case, because he was the entrepreneur and ran the house and that sort of thing, and financially probably. Again, I don't know, but he's probably the target, and she may be used as a leverage, but she's not the target. I don't think she's the target. So victimology, organization planning, control, like, do I see control in the crime? It was said that the house was very organized, very clean, nothing disturbed, like no fight, nothing that is knocked over, no searching, even though there were valuables there and probably a lot of things that could have been stolen of value.
We can confirm that, yes.
Control looks like, there's control here, that there's planning, there's organization, there's control. So that also goes to targeted and opportunistic. When you have those things, you tend to think targeted. So the thing I also look at is cause of death, and that cause of death is tied into injuries. Now, in this case, you've got, as I understand it, they eventually discovered gunshot residue on his shirt, which can only lead you to think that he was shot, right? I mean, there'd be no other reason in the morning, wearing your bathrobe and your a shirt and boxer shorts. There wouldn't be any other reason to how you would explain that. It makes the most sense, right? And if you think of Occam's razor, I don't know if you're familiar with Occam's razor.
Oh yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So, right. So
Yes.
William Occam in the 1600s, had Occam's razor, which is basically the most simple explanation is likely the correct one. Oftentimes, when we have cases like this that are very complex and very unusual, we ascribe to the offender sort of these extraordinary properties, right? Like, it must be a master genius to have been able to do this and get away with it, and nobody knew about it. But oftentimes, really, the simplest explanation is the best explanation. It's the one that makes the most sense. When the lab says, "Yeah, we have gunshot residue on the collar of his shirt," you go, "Okay, well, it's because he's probably killed, with a gunshot." Right. So that makes sense. My understanding was that she died from blunt force trauma, but
To the head.
beyond blunt force trauma, my understanding is that she was struck twice. They have skull fractures that suggest only being hit twice, and the fractures are consistent with an object that has a circular head on it. So like a hammer. Right. So you have a gun in one case and you have a hammer in a different case. So, that always makes me think, when you have one offender, you typically have one weapon, right? So once you start having multiple weapons, it starts to make me think, is it probable that we have more than one offender? So 2 different weapons, but also control is an issue. How do you control 2 adult individuals that may be in different locations? Who's controlling the boat, and who's controlling the victim? How do you control Shirley on the boat? How do you control Shirley in the house?
Why take her in the first place?
Who's getting Shirley to the boat while someone is handling Russ? It makes more sense that the purpose here is to separate them because you are looking for something from one of them. That's why, if I go back and I said that's why I didn't think Shirley was targeted, because Russ seems probably to be the primary here. And so Shirley is maybe being used as leverage, but it would suggest two different people because you've got control issues, right? Now, when you have two, this is also something that I think is really true. You have a follower and you have a leader. You don't have two leaders, almost never. There's one person who is driving this, and then the other person is essentially following instructions, doing what they're told to do. We were talking about car and boat. I think a boat is completely logical on this because one, it allows you to approach the house without having identified yourself to a guard gate. But secondly, you have a plan here. You've already have cinder blocks, right? And they didn't come from the house. You already have cordage, paracord. It didn't come from the house. You have a way to get her from the house to the 5 miles away in the lake. You got to have a boat. It's got to have gas. You got to know where you're going. If this is in the early morning hours, maybe it's dark or not very light. You have to know where you're going, right? You have to know how to get to their place, because I'm sure a lot of these places look very much the same from the water.
They do. I've been out there on a boat where their house is. For the longest time, I was actually confused about which house it was, because they do all have
if you're on a street,
look,
sure, you know which street you're on, and you know which street you got to get to their house. You're on the lake. These are big mansion type houses on a shore, all of them surrounded by trees, right? They're gonna look a lot the same. And so when you're driving on a boat, like how do you know which place it is? You probably have to know where you're going.
Having these pieces is really important for giving us an understanding into what may have happened.
If you have to know where you're going, and if you need a boat, and if you have to control two people rather than one, and if you need to know how to get away, well, this wasn't an easy crime to pull off. It took planning. It took work.
There's a lot of effort to do this. Why are you engaged in this much effort? You don't want her found.
But why is it okay to have Russell found?
That's the $24,000 question. Why is it okay with Russell? It's clearly not an issue related to trying to obscure identity. So why take the head? I mean, I think it almost makes more sense. This would suggest that someone doesn't really understand the forensics of bullets or gunshot casings. And again, they didn't find a casing, so either it's a revolver or they picked the casing up, right? I think they just mistakenly thought that the bullet could probably be linked back to the gun, which, of course, that's almost impossible with the bullet because there's so much destruction of the actual bullet itself. If that's the case, why are you concerned about that? Because you know them and you live in the area and you are afraid you might get contacted and you have this weapon, and you know what? You have a connection to this gun, and you aren't willing to like toss it into the lake. You want to keep it. So mistakenly, you think perhaps the bullet could be linked, if the police identify you and, hey, have you got any guns registered to you? We know you do. Can we take a look at that Colt Python? That is, I think, probably the reason for this. Doesn't really make any other sense.
Yeah.
I don't think the sending a message makes any sense, really. If it's true that Shirley received basically 2 blunt force injuries, and they're circular in nature, as if, she's hit on the head by a hammer. So that goes to another issue I'm looking at. Do I see evidence of anger in this crime or any crime I'm looking at? Do I see excessive injury in excess of what would be necessary to kill somebody. I don't in this case. Here you probably have a single gunshot wound to the head, and Shirley basically has been hit in the head twice, right? This isn't somebody beating her head in or caving her face in or, where she has just massive blunt force trauma. That's not what's going on here.
Mhm.
I think this is simply, at this point, either things didn't go the right way that they were looking for. And now, like, oh my God, well, we can't just let her go. She can identify us, the boat. So, yeah, we're just going to have to kill her. And that may have been the plan all along because you've got all these accoutrements, right?
Right.
Or maybe that was, well, if it goes badly, we have a way to remedy this. But probably she was targeted for this, but she's not killed in anger, right? I think she's just eliminated, right? Okay, let's knock her out. Let's hit
she's
her
a
a couple
witness.
times, knock her out, and then we'll toss her overboard.
Seems like with the net and the cord and the bricks and them bringing the instrument that did decapitate Russell with them to the scene, is it your impression the plan was always to kill them no matter what the motivation was?
It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a lot of effort. I mean, I'm looking at how much effort is there put into this. There's a lot of effort here. And I just sense that this thing did not go according to plan. The two components that make me feel by reasonable inference that it's more likely two offenders than one offender are two things. The two different weapons, that's the more minor point.
Mm-hmm.
The more major point is control. It's control through the whole thing. It's who's driving the boat, who's dealing with Russ, who's dealing with Shirley, how am I getting Shirley to the boat? It's possible that it's one guy and he's just good at control, and maybe he uses the firearm for control, but then we have multiple weapons. So, and again, you're on the lake. Do you want to use a firearm on the lake? Probably not. That's not good for maintaining some sort of anonymity. Maybe you had a hammer. Maybe you had a hammer on the boat.
Like the picture you're painting here, and if I'm trying to apply Occam's razor to it, which is something I always try to do, to me the simplest thing is, yeah, this was a plan. Look, these old folks live here in this wealthy area. They must be rich because they live there. Let's get a big score and then kill them and get away. Didn't go to plan. They didn't have the loot or the big score that these people may have been seeking, right? And perhaps the plan was always to take them both out the boat, kill them with a hammer, but Russ resisted, right? With us, the defensive wounds.
That's a very logical way to think about it. That's the way I tend to think about cases like this when I'm putting them together. Like, what's the thing that makes the most sense?
One of the most prominent theories around the Dermond case is that they were victims of an intended robbery. But because nothing was taken, that theory is often dismissed. Sheriff Sills and the FBI both say as much in our conversation.
Is that possible? Sure, but I don't find it any more possible than anything else. Again, I think somebody like that would have left a mess and wouldn't have left Rolex watches and things like that behind.
There was nothing disturbed. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't someone looking for money. If it was someone looking for money, they knew exactly where to go to get it.
Well, people say, well, there wasn't any robbery. Like they had jewelry, Yeah, that's true when everything is going according to plan. But when it goes to shit, everything goes out the window. And now you're almost like in panic mode. And now it's like, okay, how do I fix this? And the last thing you're thinking about is running upstairs and like looking through the jewelry boxes. And there was something else was going on there that I think just got disrupted. Maybe because Russ fought back. They're going, oh yeah, this 88-year-old guy, he's not going to be a problem.
Exactly.
And maybe they were driving around on the lake and they happened to see this couple, weeding out in the backyard or sitting out in a couple of chairs, and they got the idea, hey, look, this is a really old couple. Maybe they talked to him.
They live in the rich part of town, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason they got targeted. I feel very confident that they were targeted. Exactly why? I think there was a plan for it that just didn't go to fruition. But I would say they're from the area. They're familiar with this area. They know the lake. I mean, just to have a boat and all this and to have targeted those people. This isn't somebody that's just coming in off the highway or, passing through. So I think it's been addressed. I think the sheriff said, yeah, we're not dealing with a serial killer. I totally agree with that. Also, there was the issue of, was this a thrill killing? It's definitely not a thrill killing. I mean, I've looked at a couple hundred thrill kills. This is not a thrill killing. There's definitely some planning, organization, and control that's exhibited here, except at the end, right? Except at the end, I think.
Mark Safrick brings up some valid perspectives. Maybe it was a robbery, even though nothing was stolen. It seems to make sense that if things devolved from an original plan, the robbery went by the wayside.
But our conversation about this doesn't end here. What you just heard is one perspective from one profiler. We wanted to get a few ideas, a few perspectives, so we asked others too.
Hello, everybody. My name's Ray Carr. I'm a retired FBI agent, almost 27 years. During that time in the FBI, I was responsible and supervised a violent crime task force. And I was a SWAT team member, hostage negotiator, and I was also a member of the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime that did a lot of work with the Behavior Analysis Unit in Quantico.
I'm James R. Fitzgerald, commonly known as Fitz. I spent 31 years in law enforcement, 11 years as a police officer, sergeant, detective in suburban Philadelphia, then 20 years in the FBI, 7 of those years in New York City, and the other 12 and a half plus in Quantico in the Behavioral Analysis Unit as a profiler and a forensic linguist. Pretty well known for working on the Unabomb case and helping bring that to a close after 17 years. And I co-host the Cold Red podcast with my good friend and colleague, Ray Carr.
Just like Mark Safrick, they know how this stuff works. Also like Safrick, they haven't worked the Dermond case, but they're well positioned to help us fill in the holes.
Their perspective is interesting, and it's also a look into the differing processes profilers use. They know very little about the case to begin with, and that's by design. So they asked us, almost interrogated us really, questions that help them formulate a profile. Okay, let's go.
There's a lot of organization here, for someone to take the head because they don't want recovery of the bullet. Shows a great deal of organization. Then to take the woman, to tie some bricks around her if you're saying she left by the way via the dock. It seems like a lot of planning here, so our offenders are somewhat organized when you're looking at that. And then you look and you say, time of day is pretty, unless they don't get changed, but he's in his robe, his slippers, his underwear, and he's out in the garage. Now, you have to ask, was he drawn to go out in the garage? But when you decapitate someone, it can mean a couple different things. It could be ritualistic. There could be some psychological standpoint with that. It could just be to protect the identity. And, it's a very brutal method of killing someone. And when you do that, it's also, you look and you go, if it's not ritualistic, then there's a lot of anger been up here to do that because it's so brutal.
The sheriff has told us that there was no sign of any ritualistic or spiritual sort of connection to the decapitation or at the scene. So there's a layer of confusion there too. So yeah, that did not exist.
Another thing that's interesting about the decapitation that I find is that is the wound, like the cut itself is very, very clean. Yeah, and just for our audiences, decapitating isn't necessarily an easy thing to do. I don't speak from personal experience. There's a lot to get through. So what does it tell you that the wound was that clean?
First of all, I know the head is missing. How about the cutting instrument?
Also missing.
All right. And do we know if the cutting instrument was from the Dermond house or the offender brought it with him/them?
The belief is that it came with the offender.
And the reason for that is because as far as they can tell, there's nothing missing from the Dermond house.
And although she was in the water for 10 days or so, is there any way through the post-mortem, the autopsy, it could be determined if she was sexually assaulted?
No sign of that.
And nothing missing from the house, nothing known to be missing from the house.
Correct.
So we have a double homicide, a unclear motive, no greed, no sex, no revenge, of which we are aware anyway. No one benefits directly except those named in the will. And these people are in their late 80s. I hate to say it, but they may not have had too much longer to go anyway. So to expedite this murder arguably at least minimizes the will, the beneficiary gaining from this. So really, on the surface, it appears to be a motiveless crime. Now, it doesn't mean that's what it is, but there is no homicides are done for, different reasons, self-defense. I mentioned, sex, greed, jealousy, revenge. There's other things in there. But this one, there are no indications of any of those normal, quote unquote, factors involved. And let me add this too. Yeah, as Dan, I think you said, cutting off a limb or a head is not that easy. And it takes a certain kind of person to undertake that. But we have a decapitation of one person, but not both. And it's interesting too, and Ray knows this well, at every crime scene, we look at the MO, modus operandi, that is, what are the steps necessary by the offender to successfully complete the crime? Then we look at signature, and what are the steps taken that are not necessary to commit the crime, but fulfill some sort of behavioral need of the offender or offenders. And if they're thinking it's a gunshot wound to the head, well, Mr. Dermond is dead. There's no need to cut off the head. If Mrs. Dermond was beaten to death, there's really no reason to take her and weigh the feet down and drop her 6 miles away into the lake. If one body is going to be found, they're going to assume the other one is also a body deceased somewhere. There's a lot of inconsistencies and sort of dual activities here, which it may be the same motivation, but they could also be related, which to me, and I know we've been using singular and plural here, offenders, I can't rule out that we have more than one offender here. And the head very likely could have been taken as a trophy or a souvenir. Serial offenders or even one-time offenders are known for doing that. And that's something that they put somewhere. It may or may not be in a freezer kept like, I guess it was Dahmer and a few others have done that. But it could be buried in some place and this person goes out to visit every once in a while. And whether these were targets of opportunity, the Dermonds, or they looked at him the wrong way, this person or persons chased them off the lawn one day, called them because they were speeding around the community. Who knows that? Or it just could have been very random.
What Jim is right, and he says, the head taken as a trophy, but I see it as at the minimum, it's extremely sadistic. But there's also a mental illness component to this, and it's a lot about power and control. When you take someone's head or something of that nature, it's the epitome of total domination over your victim when you take the head. And it's one thing to take and cut the head off, but to cut the head off and take it with you, Jim's right. It's likely maybe somewhere where it's going back and visit. And one thing I always say is, why were these people chosen at this particular point in time?
It's victimology. That's what victimology is, right? Getting back to that, that's so important from any investigative standpoint to look at. Why were they chosen? Were they specifically selected? That tells us one thing, or were they random? And I don't think this is random.
One thing that's obviously confusing to everyone is, why were the victims killed and treated so differently post-mortem, right? Why not kill them both there? Why kill one way and take his head and not kill the other the same way? Like, why the totally different types of killings? That's very strange to me.
It is, and that's why it is suggestive of me of at least two offenders. Now, between these two offenders, there's going to be one, and I'm going to go with male, because violent criminals of this sort usually are males, but I would say there's an alpha male and a beta male involved in this. But I definitely see, as Ray mentioned, diagnosable mental health issues here. But I'm going to tie in something else too. I would say that and or youthfulness. I see potentially someone in their teens, late teens, early 20s. Of course, there's chronological age and there's emotional age. And so it's tough sometimes to gauge for them to exactly match up. But in cases I've worked in the past where there's just some unexplained elements to it, there are unexplained behavior on the scene and not common to other crime scenes. Yet they showed a little bit of forensic countermeasures in, first of all, weighing the body down, and second of all, putting the towels by the garage door, which I get the reason they're doing that, but they could have easily pulled the body back farther into the garage by, the inside door, and the blood probably never would have made it that way. So I have a feeling they think they were trying to maybe impress each other. If it's two offenders saying, hey, I have an idea, let's block the garage door seepage from underneath it, and let's get these towels. Oh, okay, good idea. And then, well, you want to cut the head off. I want to weigh her down in the water, and we'll beat the hell out of her on the boat or on the dock or wherever they chose to do that. So those particulars we won't know until the identity of the killer is or killers is determined, the specifics. Again, to sum up, the suspect profile, youthfulness and or mental health, diagnosable mental health issues of some sort.
This is just occurring to me, this thought. Is it possible that they made her watch what they did to him?
Can't be ruled out.
Yeah, yeah, it's possible.
But just thinking about the motivation, I mean, if whatever is motivating them was more directed towards her, because obviously if he was shot in the head and, which they think is what happened because of the gunshot residue, that's a quick death. That's a quick death. Beating someone to death is not. It's almost the anger, the sadism was directed possibly towards her in a way. How does that feel to you?
Well, there's a lot of anger here. There's an extreme amount of anger because when you kill somebody by shooting him in the head and then you decapitate him, that's behavior that Jim already said is unnecessary for the successful completion of the crime, right? There's some psychological or physiological desire or need that individual has. Now, what's to say that this woman, when they first came into her, didn't receive one of those abrasions or cuts to the head when she was initially struck and she's down and she's out? I mean, look, they're in their late 80s. You don't have to hit them very hard to disable them. Anybody at that age. And I'm just sitting here and I'm thinking the organization from into the garage with the towels, into the weighted bricks on the woman, and all these things, violent behavior doesn't happen. You don't wake up one morning and go, I think I'm going to do this today. Now, there are some that have a mental, but there's always like a process. Sometimes it starts with a grievance, whether it's real or whether it's perceived to the individual or the offender, it's real. And then you have an idea of what you're going to do. And then there's a planning and preparation of it and so forth. For me, there's too much organization for this thing to just be completely random. It's something that was planned. They knew they were doing this.
I wanted to circle back real quick, talking about kind of the crime scene and all these dynamics that we're talking about. Do you have any thoughts on whether at some point this crime took a left turn and what they went there with the intention of doing was not what they wound up doing? Like, was there some sort of we talked about there was nothing taken. There was necessarily no defensive wounds, but is there any possibility that they didn't go in there with the intention of taking her and decapitating him?
Well, if we think one or both of them brought a saw with them, that's a clue that there was some preconceived notion or pre-planning involved in cutting something off from someone. Turned out to be the head of Mr. Dermond. So I don't see this person or persons as criminal masterminds. These aren't international hitmen that came in, and I don't want to give them any sort of pats on the back in that regard. There's some level of organization because they got away with it. The towels and bringing the salt. They brought their kill kit with them, and it looks like they had plans of sawing something off at least one of the victims and then weighting down another victim. You're describing a very clean cut which, as we said earlier, not that easy to do. So this had to be a little bit, at least a 18-inch blade of some sort on it.
Now, the picture you guys are painting of these offenders, to me, suggests that this kind of crime, we should see something like that again, or that this is not a one-time deal, or that's the impression I'm getting. Like, is this something that you only do once if it's the sort of crime that you're talking about?
I'm a student of true crime history, and it so happens this year, 2024, is the 100th anniversary of the Leopold and Loeb case in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
They came from affluent families, 2 young men, early 20s, I believe, college students, and they knew they were so smart they could commit the perfect crime, and they could get away with it. So they kidnapped young Bobby Franks, 14 years old, and wound up killing him. It wasn't really even a kidnapping. One of them left their glasses at the crime scene, their prescription glasses, and the police tracked them back that way. And that was kind of the crime of the early century. And I'm not going to give, again, the killers of the Dermonds necessarily put them in that status. They're affluent, well-educated young men. But I wouldn't be surprised if this was also some kind of a challenge, and they wanted to see these 2 people, if they could outdo each other in killing their victims in 2 separate ways. And then they may have gotten scared. They may have already been interviewed and got the what scared out of them and said, I'm not ever going to do this again. And this could have been their one shot. This may have been something, hey, buddy, whoever you are, we proved we could do it. Let's shut up and go our separate ways and take it from there. I'd say in this case, the offender came from within a mile or 2, roughly. They may have already been interviewed, but I would also look back in the early 2000s for anyone who has any indication, not even an arrest, but any police reports from that whole area of animal cruelty, and that may be a clue as to who killed the Dermonds.
Jim's right. The individuals definitely had a familiarity with the area. So I totally concur with what he's saying, that the individuals were probably from that area or had a familiarity with that area, because, if you're coming by boat, I mean, what are you going to do? You have a boat ramp somewhere, you're going to put the boat in, and, if that's the case, or did they come by car? Either way, they knew exactly where they were going.
We spoke to a lot of people in law enforcement about this case. Some are directly involved, some aren't. But with everyone, there is some consensus on just a couple things. The killer or killers knew the area. This wasn't random. And Sheriff Sills says it doesn't appear the victims knew the killers. But if you ask the profilers, that doesn't mean the Dermonds weren't targeted. So what do we think happened? Yeah, let's talk about it.
So over these last few episodes, we've heard the what, the who, the how, the possibilities. We just heard for some profilers. That's all we've got on the Lake Oconee murders, on the murders of Russell and Shirley Dermond. So now it's time for us to let you know what we think. What do we think about all this? What do we think happened? How do we think it happened? And, we have as much information as you do. So this is our best take. And Andrew, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
After everything we've heard, what do you think is the truth here, as close as we can get, at least?
I've long thought this. This has been my kind of theory. There's been one wrinkle I can't get out, but the familiarity with the Dermond house and that community, to me, lends my thinking to somebody who knows the community but does not live in the community.
Yeah.
And if you advance to the next stage of that, who is that? Is it a grandson or a nephew or a son of someone who lives there who is down on their luck, an addict of some kind, some sort of situation where there's a grandparent or a great uncle or an aunt who's very giving to their down on their luck, addict nephew or nephews, whatever.
So you think it's a little more closer to home than a random person who lives in the area?
Yeah, and I think with that in mind, this was somebody who was looking to commit a robbery because they needed money or something for drugs, for, to pay off some sort of debt that they owed to somebody or something.
So you think that the Dermonds knew the perpetrators?
No, I don't
You don't
think
think
they
that?
knew the perpetrator. I think it was the Dermonds might have known this person's aunt or uncle or grandparent or something.
Ah, I see what you're saying.
You see what I mean?
Yes.
So they did not know this person, but this person knew the community,
Gotcha.
didn't know the Dermonds. And the Dermonds were a pathway to getting something that could get them, score, whether it's drugs or, like I said, paying off a debt of some kind, some sort of act of desperation. And just like Mark said, that robbery was the intention, but at some point this thing took a left turn and went sideways.
Yeah.
That's kind of as far as I can go with it.
Sure.
That's kind of what I think is the circumstance here.
Yeah, I'm somewhat aligned with you with a few differences. I don't know if it went sideways. I think it was always intended to go sideways. So you heard me allude to it earlier when we were talking with Mark. I think that obviously the person is familiar with the area. You would have to be familiar with the area to use the boat in the way they use the boat, to get Shirley out there. I think they did come in by boat, but
also
yeah.
let me just throw this out there. Familiar with the area and familiar with like this cove and this specific house are two very different
things. So like what I think happened is these were people out on a boat, right? And they're cruising Lake Oconee, and one day they see the Dermonds in the rich part of town. Where they lived was a very wealthy area, and they probably saw these elderly folks and said, you know what, I have an idea. And the idea grew and it took form, and I think they went after them to get a big score. They probably figured there was some, like in Die Hard, some safe full of bearer bonds or something like that, right? Gold to be had, a big score to take down. Maybe they were going to hold them until they were able to transfer their assets to what, and when they get there, it doesn't exist. The big score, the big loot, it's not there because it wasn't there. And I do think the intent was always to kill them because we see all the forethought that went into this.
Sure.
Bringing the weapon, bringing the weapons.
Yeah, and those weapons aren't just in case this thing goes sideways.
Right. Yeah. Like the intent was always to kill them. Why bring that blade? You have the cinder block or the cinder block caps with the nets to weigh the bodies down. I don't know if they intended to kill Russell in the garage. That seems to be somewhat improvised. I'm guessing that was somewhat improvised, but I don't know. I think the plan may have always been to cut off his head because they brought the blade because that was their method of they were going to shoot him in the head, remove the head so they couldn't recover the bullet and match the bullet. I think that's correct thinking on the part of our profilers. It's just weird, man.
It is weird. And when I talked to Sheriff Sills and Andy Smith, the FBI agent, what was really interesting was they were talking about everybody that they've tried to kind of outsource insight on this case. And everyone kind of comes in with some level of like, I'm going to be able to help here. I'm going to be able to like crack this open.
Yeah.
Right. Or there's some optimism about that. And at every turn, everybody winds up walking away, shaking their head like, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you.
You know what the weirdest thing to me is why Russell was killed and treated in one way and Shirley was killed and treated in another. And I think maybe Mark alluded to this. It did go sideways at the end. I think they probably intended to kill and dispose of them both in the same ways. Probably the way they ended up killing Russell. I'm guessing that they were both going to be shot and beheaded, and they were going to use those nets and rocks to weigh down the remains. But if my theory is correct, if there was a score to be had, and they probably just didn't believe that it didn't exist, so they took Shirley to keep the coercion going, to get what they thought was the truth. And obviously they didn't get what they wanted.
We've talked about like the sophistication of whoever did this and how intelligent they are about understanding how to get away with this. On some level, the idea that they thought Shirley's body wouldn't come to the surface insinuates to me that they weren't that sophisticated.
Yeah.
The body's always going to come up. You know what I mean? Like just the way decomposition works and with how like gases and stuff in the body, like that never works. It's always going to, like I feel like they would have known that if they were sophisticated enough.
Yeah, or they didn't use enough weight. We saw when we explored Israel Keys, he was successful in weighing bodies down and keeping them down there, if he is to be believed. Of course, this is all theory. We don't know. the hope is that this DNA that was recently recovered, this touch DNA, will yield results. We'll find a match, because it seems pretty apparent that whoever did this had to be familiar with the area. It's a big lake. The lake they lived on, Lake Oconee, is a huge lake. So it's not like, oh yeah, it could just be this house or this person with this boat. There are so many people and so many boats and so many houses and so many places lining this lake in multiple counties, right? So it's more of a needle in a haystack than you think it would be.
Yeah, and I think it's worth underscoring too, the DNA is not the magic bullet. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all, solving this case. There's a possibility of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the people in charge of this case are waiting patiently and hoping with some optimism, but they also have to be there has to be some guarded optimism too, because it's not necessarily just going to solve itself with DNA.
Hopefully sometime soon, we'll get a call from Sheriff Howard Sills saying, guys, we got it.
He tells me he's going to do that.
That's what we think happened. What do you think happened? Let us know by hitting us up on social at deviant.podcast, on TikTok, on Instagram. Also check out our Patreon. You can send us messages there via our Discord. That's deviantpodcast.com. And next week in our off-script episode, we're going to get to some of the things we weren't able to get to in the main series, and we're also going to share what you think. So definitely let us know in the comment sections too of wherever you're listening or watching this, and we'll share some of what you had to say.
I can assure you I did not receive a ticket for jaywalking.
And we'll hear the results of Andrew's jaywalking trial after these. Until then, thanks for listening. Deviant is written, produced, and executive produced by Clark Goldband, Andrew Iden, and me, Dan Semitovich, with editorial and production consultation from Jenny Ament. Shuvo Sur does our original composing, and our...
Do you always have to think about how to say his name?
No, I've known him for years, man. He's great.
I know, but still...
People get your name wrong more often.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Anyway.
I'm just trying to add some dynamics to this closing credit.
So sure. It needs it because we say it the same way every time, including the final part. Sales, production, and marketing support comes from our partners at Gemini 13. Deviant is a production of...
Cold Open Media.
We'll see you next time.